Take a hard look at this crash because the pilot's deadly mistake is not what killed him. And the most shocking part of the story is that after 2 years of investigating this tragedy, the NTSB never talked about this mistake in their final report. That's why in this video, I'm going to share with you everything the NTSB missed during their investigation and the truth about what really caused this tragedy. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your Pilot Debrief. Our story begins on January 18th, 2008, when a pilot with almost 1,100 hours of flight time was flying a brand new airplane by himself from Waco, Texas to the San Antonio International Airport. The weather in San Antonio was overcast skies with a 600-foot ceiling, and even though the pilot had an instrument rating, this short trip turned deadly when he was moments away from landing. When the pilot first checked in with the controller, he told them that he wanted to fly a coupled approach. Since he's flying by himself, a coupled approach is a very safe way to fly in the weather because it means that he's going to have the autopilot fly the aircraft for him, so I think he made the right decision. He's flying the ILS, and that's made up of two signals. You've got the localizer and the glide slope. The localizer is your horizontal guidance, or how far left or right you are, and the glide slope is the vertical guidance. Now the controller cleared him for the approach and told him to fly a heading of 330 to intercept the localizer. We can see from the transcript that he confirmed the heading, and the reason this is important is because it confirms that he wasn't confused, and as long as he's on that heading, and assuming that his autopilot and avionics are working and set up correctly, then the autopilot will turn the aircraft to align with the course. Unfortunately, we don't really know what happened because about a minute after he switched to the tower controller, they asked him if he was turning off course. And one of the most frustrating aspects of this investigation, and there are many, is that the NTSB reviewed the radar data for the flight that shows where the aircraft is and what he was doing, but the NTSB never made this data available to the public. If the NTSB had shared that data, we could see all of this, but for now, all we know is that they gave him a new heading to fly and then told him to switch back to the approach controller to try again. On his second try, the controller starts him off on a heading of 030 and then told him to turn left to 330 and then cleared him for the approach a few seconds later. Almost 20 seconds goes by, and from the radio calls, it seems like the pilot kept turning left past that 330 heading because the controller said that he's now southwest bound, and he gave him a new heading to fly going south. The pilot said that it's just not coupling, and what he means by that is the autopilot is not turning the aircraft like it's supposed to in order to line up with the localizer signal. However, I think there's something else going on. So far, he's messed up the approach twice, and this is the point where he needs to forget about using the autopilot and just hand fly the approach. The ceiling is only 600 feet, so it's not that terrible, but if he's not comfortable with hand flying the ILS in the weather, then he can always just divert to his alternate airport because that should have better weather where he can fly a visual approach. Unfortunately, he doesn't do that, and the NTSB doesn't talk about either of these options in their final report. Pay close attention to this next part though, because this is when things start to spiral out of control and the pilot only has about 15 minutes left to live. He's on his third attempt at flying the approach, and the controller is trying to vector him around, and now the pilot's having trouble controlling his altitude because he was told to climb to 3,000 feet, but he stayed down at 2,600. The controller gives him a heading to join the localizer, and he reads that back, but then he stops responding to the controller, and he's not at the altitude that he's supposed to be at. He eventually managed to say his call sign, and this next part is really important because the controller said he turned through the 330 heading and is now heading southbound again. The reason I bring this up is because the NTSB would say in their report that in their review of the radar data and the ATC audio, the pilot was able to turn to headings and climb to altitudes assigned by air traffic control. That might have been true for 99% of the flight, but the part that mattered the most, the part where he's about to crash, we've seen 3 times now that he wasn't able to turn to the assigned heading or climb to his assigned altitude. And not only that, but you can tell the situation has gotten worse because now he's not answering the controller's questions. In my opinion, this is a classic sign of a pilot that's getting task saturated. Remember, he's in the weather, he's by himself, and things aren't working out the way that he expected them to, and he's starting to get overwhelmed. Single pilot IFR flying can be very demanding. It doesn't matter how many hours you have, especially if the autopilot isn't doing what you want it to do. Unexpected threats can easily cause you to become task saturated, and that's when you've got to focus on the basics. Aviate, navigate, then communicate. Keep the aircraft flying safely, and if you're not sure where you're going or what you're doing, then talk to the controller and get help. They need to know you're having a problem, and they're going to do whatever they can to help you out. And that's why I thought his next radio call was really good, because he said, "One moment, please, sir." That's one of the best things a pilot can say to the controller, because it lets them know that you've got too much going on, and I liked how the controller acknowledged this, but still reminded him that he needed to be at a safe altitude of 3,000 feet. Almost a minute goes by before the controller checked back in just to say, "Let me know when you have the aircraft under control," and that's when the pilot finally declared an emergency and admitted that he's lost control of the aircraft, and unfortunately, that would be the last radio call the pilot would make before crashing about 5 or 6 minutes later. Over the course of the 2-year investigation, the NTSB focused on two main possibilities. Either there was something wrong with the aircraft or there was something wrong with the pilot. Let's start with the aircraft. The aircraft the pilot was flying was essentially a brand new Piper PA-46-500 Malibu Meridian. The pilot had recently purchased the aircraft, and it was delivered to him with only 45 and a half hours on the airframe. In case you're wondering, this is not a cheap aircraft, and if you want to buy a relatively new one today, it's going to cost you about $2.6 million. The aircraft was delivered to the pilot in August of 2007, about 5 months before the crash, and when they reviewed the maintenance work orders after the crash, here's what they discovered. This paragraph is all the NTSB said in their final report about the maintenance history of the aircraft. It had an instance of runaway trim, but the NTSB never talked about the work order for that, so we don't know anything about it. They also said the aircraft repeatedly experienced pitch trim problems, but they only referenced one work order about that issue, and they said that no action was taken. And that could be for a number of reasons, but all we know is they said the trim was working on at least 2 flights after that work order. The other thing that's really shocking to me is that the NTSB docket showed that there were 2 witness statements, but only one of those witnesses made it into the final report. Remember, the work order was dated December 4th, but if we back that up a week or two before that, an eyewitness said that he spoke with the pilot on either November 19th or the 30th when he was on a trip in Waco, Texas. He said that the pilot was disgusted that the aircraft was having so many problems, and he had told Qatar Aviation, located in San Antonio, to come get it because he wasn't going to fly it anymore. In other words, he had no confidence in the aircraft. There are no interviews with Qatar Aviation, no details about whether the company came to pick up the aircraft in Waco or if the pilot flew it out of there himself, and there's no information about any other pilots that might have flown the plane, and none of this is mentioned in the NTSB final report. The only thing the NTSB said was they didn't find any anomalies with the airframe or engine that would have prevented normal operation, and unfortunately, most of the wreckage was completely consumed by fire, and that's when the NTSB would shift the focus of their investigation to the pilot. The pilot's first flying lesson was on September 23, 2001, and his first solo was 7 months later in April 2002, after he had accumulated 66 hours of flight time. Normally, most pilots can do their first solo flight after about 10 to 30 hours, depending on your skill level, so 66 hours is a long time to solo. The pilot would end up doing his private pilot check ride in August of 2003. That's 2 years from the time that he first started learning to fly. And during those 2 years, he logged 226 flight hours, with 206 of those hours being instructional. Unfortunately, the check ride was recorded as incomplete, and technically this doesn't mean that he failed. An evaluation can be marked incomplete for any number of reasons, but the NTSB didn't interview his instructor or explain when he eventually passed that check ride. Now you have to appreciate the fact that this guy wouldn't quit. He clearly needed or wanted more instruction, and he had the money to pay for it. That being said, I'm wondering if his instructor ever sat him down and said, "Hey, maybe this isn't the right path for you." Because if you're not able to pass a private pilot check ride after 2 years and 206 hours of flight instruction, then in my opinion, it's time for you to maybe consider some other options. And I say that with the utmost respect for his family that had to endure this tragedy. Not everyone is cut out to be a pilot, and if you can't recognize that yourself, then your instructor needs to be the one to help you understand that. Keep in mind that this is still 5 years before the crash, and during those 5 years, this guy would eventually get his private pilot's license, and he also got an instrument rating and logged a total of 1,049 hours by the time of the crash, but 608 of those hours were instructional. That's just crazy to me. 60% of his flight time was with an instructor, and what's more shocking is that the NTSB didn't interview a single person that flew with him during this time frame, and they don't talk about when he finished his check rides or whether he passed his instrument ride on the first try or not. The other shocking detail in his logbook was that he had only logged 58 hours in the Piper PA-46 at the time of the crash, and 51 of those hours were with an instructor. He only had 7 hours of actual instrument time in this aircraft, and all of those were with an instructor, so he had never flown solo in this aircraft in the weather before. Again, no one talked to his instructor to find out more about any of this, and I think now you might see why maybe the NTSB didn't dig too deep into the potential maintenance issues with the aircraft. I'll admit that it's certainly possible there was nothing wrong with the aircraft and it was all pilot error, not understanding the avionics, but we'll never know because the NTSB didn't call his most recent instructor to find out. Instead, the NTSB also zeroed in on the pilot's toxicology report. The autopsy found Zoloft and doxylamine in his system. Zoloft is a prescription antidepressant and doxylamine is an antihistamine, but it's also a sleep aid that's used for treating insomnia. Although Zoloft can be approved by the FAA under special considerations, the pilot didn't have that, and neither of these medications were reported to the FAA. Because the FAA had known about them, he would have been grounded from flying. So now that you know all of that, let's take a look at what an eyewitness saw in the final moments before the crash, what the NTSB said was the probable cause, and what I think the mistake was that really killed him. After the pilot had tried the third approach and then turned south, a retired Navy T-6 instructor pilot was outside that day and recalled seeing the aircraft break out below the weather and leveling off about 300 feet above the ground heading south. Then a few minutes later, he saw it heading north but going a lot slower. My guess is he was trying to get below the weather, but we don't know for sure because remember, we don't have the radar data, and he had said on the radio that he lost control and he needed to get control. Honestly, the crash could have been due to the fact that he was using the trim incorrectly and he didn't know how to use the autopilot, which sounds very similar to the YouTube pilot Jenny Blaylock that had some training issues and trouble understanding the autopilot and aircraft trim, and she crashed and killed herself and her father, who was a passenger on her flight. However, in this crash, the eyewitness said that he assumed the pilot was flying VFR below the weather and trying to follow the road, but as the aircraft was heading north, he saw it start rolling to the right to an extreme nose-low attitude where it disappeared behind the trees, and the aircraft crashed into a barn where it caught on fire and the pilot died. The NTSB said the deadly mistake that killed him was the pilot's failure to execute an instrument approach, and over-the-counter medication was a contributing factor. Although I agree that he made a deadly mistake by not flying the approach correctly, technically it was his failure to control airspeed and altitude that resulted in a stall. And in my opinion, the deadly mistake that killed him was deciding to do the flight in the first place. Unfortunately, this pilot needed a lot of training to make it as far as he did, and he wasn't confident in the aircraft, and he probably wasn't confident in himself. And under those circumstances, it wasn't a good idea to try a solo flight in the weather when you've never flown solo in the weather before in this aircraft. And I wish the NTSB had talked to his instructors to better understand how he was able to make it this far as a pilot, and my heart goes out to his family and his friends because this never should have happened. I hope you were able to learn something from this debrief, and if you did, then be sure to check out another one on the channel, and I'll see you next time.